Welcome to our virtual worship service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Emerald Coast. I'm Charlene Farley, and I'll be your service leader this morning. Before we continue, there are a few announcements that I would like to tell you about. Sustaining our spiritual connections is challenging in these pandemic days, and that's why I hope that you'll keep in touch with us by reading your UUFEC news on Friday, reviewing the Sunday's copy of the Order of Service that is emailed to you every Sunday morning, and just checking on our UUFEC website frequently for other updates and news. Now, if you're not presently a subscriber to our e-news and you would like to be one, all you have to do is to email our office administrator at admin@uufec.com and request that you wish to be on our group email. Our fellowship also needs your financial support. All contributions of any amount are welcome and allow us to support 5 different local charities. Checks may be made to UUFEC and mailed to the UUFEC Post Office Box 205, Valparaiso, Florida 32580. This morning, the themes of our service are empathy, compassion, and love for our shared humanity. Our minister today is the Reverend Gregg, Senior Minister at the UU Congregation of Frederick, Maryland. In his pre-recorded message, Reverend Gregg reminds us of our first Unitarian Universalist principle, that of affirming and promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. No exceptions allowed. Now, I think you'll agree that this ideal is more easily said than practiced, particularly in these polarized times where divisive rhetoric is so prevailing. After the service is ended, we invite you to join us in our Zoom coffee hour that starts at 11 a.m. The link is in your e-news and in the order of service. Give us your feedback on this sermon, or just let us know how you're faring in these difficult times. Oh, and don't forget to bring your cup of coffee with you. And now, we'll have the lighting of our chalice performed this morning by Sophia Lopez.
In Need of Healing by Maureen Killeran. Welcome, you who come in need of healing. You who are confused or have been betrayed. Welcome with your problems and your pain. Welcome too your joys and your wonderings. Welcome your need to hope, your longing for assurance. Instead of answers, here may you find safety for your questions. Instead of promises, may you find community for your struggles, people with hands and hearts to join you in engaging the challenges and changes of our day.
Hi, I'm Jan, and today I'm reading our book, Alejandro's Gift. I'm reading this book in honor of my mother. She gave it to my children when they were very small, and she lived in the desert and really enjoyed the desert scenery and animals. So Alejandro's Gift by Richard Albert and beautifully illustrated by Sylvia Long. Also, I'm reading this book in my garden. And behind me over here, I have a hummingbird feeder. And if we're lucky, you'll see the hummingbirds flying about and maybe even feeding there. And then behind me over here, these things going at great angles are what's left over of a little sunflower crop. And the reason they're all falling down is squirrels have been climbing the stalks to get at the sunflower seeds. So I didn't realize when I planted my sunflower garden that I was planting a jungle gym for the squirrels, but they do seem to have enjoyed it. So, Alejandro's Gift. Oh dear, here we go. Okay. Alejandro's small adobe house stood beside a lonely desert road. Beside the house stood a well and a windmill to pump water from the well. Water for Alejandro and for his only companion, a burro. It was a lonely place, and Alejandro welcomed any who stopped by to refresh themselves at the well. But visitors were few, and after they left, Alejandro felt lonelier than before. The more easily to endure the lonely hours, Alejandro planted a garden filled with carrots, beans, large brown onions, tomatoes and corn, melons, squash, and small red peppers. Most mornings, Alejandro was tending the garden, watching it grow. There were times he cherished, and he often stayed for hours working until driven indoors by the desert heat. The days went by, one after another, with little change, until one morning, there was an unexpected visitor. This visitor came not from the desert road, but from the desert itself. A ground squirrel crept from the underbrush. Moving warily over the sand, it hesitated and looked around. Alejandro paused, keeping very quiet as the squirrel approached the garden. It ran up to one of the furrows, drank its fill of water, and scampered away. After it left, Alejandro realized that for those few moments, his loneliness had been all but forgotten. And because he felt less lonely, Alejandro found himself hoping the squirrel would come again. The squirrel did come again, from time to time bringing along small friends. Wood rats and pocket gophers, jackrabbits, kangaroo rats, pocket mice, birds too became aware of Alejandro's garden. Roadrunners, Gila woodpeckers, thrashers, cactus wrens, sage sparrows, mourning doves, and others came in the evening to perch on the branches of a mesquite bush or rest in the arms of a lone saguaro before dropping down to get a quick drink before nightfall. Occasionally, even an old desert tortoise could be seen plodding toward the garden. Suddenly, Alejandro found that time was passing more quickly. He was rarely lonely. He had only to look up from his hoe or from wherever he might be at any moment to find a small friend nearby. For a while, this was all that mattered to Alejandro. But after a time, he wasn't so sure. He began asking himself if there was something more important than just making himself less lonely. It took Alejandro little time to see there was. He began to realize that his tiny desert friends came to his garden not for company, but for water. And he found himself thinking of the other animals in the desert. Animals like the coyote, the desert gray fox, bobcats, skunks, badgers, long-nosed cotis, the peccaries, sometimes called javelinas, the short-tempered wild pigs of the desert, the antlered mule deer, the does, and the fawns. Finding enough water was not a problem. With his windmill and well, Alejandro could supply ample water for any and all. Getting it to those who needed it was something else. The something else, Alejandro decided, was a desert water hole. Without delay, Alejandro started digging. It was tiring work, taking many days in the hot desert sun. But the thought of giving water to so many thirsty desert dwellers more than made up for the drudgery. And when it was filled, Alejandro was pleased with the gift that he had made for his desert friends. There was good reason to suppose it would take time for the larger animals to discover their new source of water, so Alejandro was patient. He went about as usual, feeding his burro, tending the garden, and doing countless other chores. Days passed and nothing happened. Still, Alejandro was confident. But the days turned to weeks, and it was still quiet at the water hole. Why, Alejandro wondered. Why weren't they coming? What had he done wrong? The absence of the desert folk might have remained a mystery had Alejandro not come out of the house one morning when a skunk was in the clearing beyond the waterhole. Seeing Alejandro, the skunk darted to safety in the underbrush. It suddenly became very clear why Alejandro's gift was being shunned. Alejandro couldn't believe he had been so thoughtless, but what was important now was to put things right as quickly as possible. Can you guess what Alejandro might be needing to do? Waterhole number 2 was built far from the house and screened by heavy desert growth. When it was filled and ready, Alejandro waited with mixed emotions. He was hopeful, yet he couldn't forget what had happened the last time. As it turned out, he was not disappointed. The animals of the desert did come, each as it made its own discovery. Because the waterhole was now sheltered from the small adobe house and the desert road, the animals were no longer fearful. And although Alejandro could not see through the desert growth surrounding the waterhole, he had ways of knowing it was no longer being shunned. Can you guess how he might know the animals are coming? By the twitter of birds gathering in the dusk, by the rustling of mesquite in the quiet desert evening, telling of the approach of a coyote, a badger, or maybe a desert fox, by the soft hoofbeats of a mule deer, or the unmistakable sound of a herd of peccaries charging toward the waterhole. They were coming. And in these moments when Alejandro sat quietly listening for the sounds of his desert neighbors, he knew that the gift was not so much a gift that he had given, but a gift that he had received. And that is Alejandro's gift. And here you can learn about all the different desert animals that were mentioned in our little book. And we sign off with a beautiful desert sky. I don't know if anything came to visit. I just saw a bird fly by. The birds like the sunflowers also. And sometimes when I've been out here practicing, the hummingbirds do come and fly around there. So now you have to think, are you doing things to invite animals to your yard? Or offering them gifts? And what can you do when you're lonely? Bye.
Love changes us. You cannot love or be loved and not be changed by it. There are physiological and chemical reactions in the human body. It's part of why sharing love is so scary. We are called to share love, though. It's part of being human. Reverend Lon Ray Call said, "Prayer does not change things. Prayer changes people, and people change things." Allowing yourself to feel changes you, connects you more deeply to a time and a situation. It focuses your mind on something in the world and etches thoughts and memories on your sense of self. In that way, allowing yourself to feel deeply is an act of prayer, changing who you are. You can choose to seek out those emotions that can change you for the better. Compassion is a choice to allow yourself to feel for another person. Take that risk, because even though people do get hurt, the world has never been worse off because someone cared or was cared for.
Occasionally I'm asked, why does Unitarian Universalism have such a long name? And from a marketing perspective, it was arguably not the best decision to saddle ourselves with this 10-syllable name based on two ancient Christian heresies: Unitarianism, rejecting the idea that the Trinity was the only or best way of understanding the divine, and affirming the unity of God, that whatever we mean by that name, God, all these different religions are ultimately responding to the same realities. There's a certain unity there. And Universalism, rejecting the idea that anyone will suffer eternal damnation, and affirming that no one should be left out of the circle of love. Interestingly, before we settled on this compromise name of Unitarian Universalism, other possible names were considered: the Universal Church, the United Liberal Church of America, the Free Church of America, or the Free Church Fellowship. But in 1961, when the American Unitarian Association merged with the Universalist Church of America, both organizations that had been separate a long time, that had flirted with each other about merging for more than a century, they were anxious as the marriage was about to happen that they would each potentially lose their distinct identities. As a result, we inherited this unwieldy name, Unitarian Universalism. Interestingly, if you go back and look at people around the time of the merger right afterwards, you actually see both camps thinking they won. So Unitarians thought they won because Unitarianism came first, and Universalism thought they won because they saw Unitarianism as a modifier. So we were Universalists, we were Unitarian Universalists, adjective, noun. Anyway. Hashtag grammar nerd, right? Anyway, so from another angle, our forebears were right that our long name actually is a regular reminder of this dual heritage of Unitarianism and Universalism. And this past Friday was the anniversary of John Murray preaching the first Universalist sermon in America on September 30th, 1770. The actual history is a little more complicated than that, but that's the date that we have settled on. You'll hear a lot more about that occasion as we approach 2020, which will be the 250th anniversary of Universalism in America. So on this Sunday closest to the anniversary of the first Universalist sermon in the U.S., I want to explore just a little bit about what does Universalism mean today. And as I said a little bit earlier, part of our Universalist heritage is this rejection of original sin and the idea that humans are totally depraved. And it's an affirmation of what our UU First Principle now calls the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Over time, the aspiration to respect each person's worth and dignity led Universalism to evolve from just this universal salvation for everyone in the next world to what is sometimes called loving the hell out of people in this world. It's often easiest to love those who are most like us, but our Universalist heritage challenges us to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Nancy gave us some examples of the difficulty of doing that within our own families. As many of you have heard me say before, our family can push our buttons the easiest because our family sewed on our buttons in the first place. One of the most interesting explorations I've found recently of what Universalism means today is a short book, just around 100 pages, by my colleague, the Reverend Nathan Walker. He used to be the minister up in Philadelphia, the Unitarian congregation there, and has now written a book called Cultivating Empathy, the Worth and Dignity of Every Person Without Exception. He's actually now the executive director of the Religious Freedom Center at the museum in Washington, D.C. And anyone who regularly facilitates discussions about the First Amendment, especially about religious liberty, has a lot of experience navigating conflict between opposing sides, because religious liberty is one of the hottest issues of controversy in our time in this country. The primary spiritual practice that Nate has been experimenting with related to our first principle, and that he invites us, the readers, to experiment with, is what he calls the moral imagination. The ability to anticipate or project oneself into the middle of a moral dilemma or conflict and try to understand all the various points of view. Note that understanding all those points of view doesn't mean you have to agree with all of them. It just means understanding them and where they're coming from. Along those lines, I'll admit that there are many people and groups in the world today that I do not yet fully understand, and I continue to try to use my moral imagination to increasingly comprehend where are they coming from. So what are the parallels in your life? What people or groups do you find most mystifying? Who is most difficult for you to understand, to empathize with, to recognize their inherent worth and dignity? Where might you be called to experiment with expanding your moral imagination? In the Thursday night class that I'm teaching here at UUCF on Thursday evenings on what's fair and who decides, navigating the ethics of privilege, one of the insights we've been discussing is that the ways in which we are privileged are often invisible to us. In contrast, it's much easier to see the ways that we're different, the ways that we're swimming against the current of society. I'll give you a few examples. Sexism is more obvious to women than to men, because sexism is, men are just swimming with that current of sexism. They're just going through life, and sexism is what women stumble over and against and have to jump over, and so sexism is more obvious to women than to men. Racism is more obvious to people of color than to white people. Classism is more obvious to people who are poor than to people who are rich, that the ways in which we are privileged are often invisible to us, unless we learn to use our moral imagination. I could go on in regard to sexual identity, ability, nationality, religion, and other social categories. But again, the point is that we can use our moral imagination to consider the ways that other people and groups experience the world very differently than we do, and that can empower our work to authentically build a more just and equitable world. To give you just one example of the moral imagination in action, consider the testimony of Ruby Bridges. In 1960, when she was 6 years old, she was the first black child to integrate an all-white school in New Orleans. That same year, a child psychologist interviewed her several times about how this experience was affecting her, and he was stunned at her moral imagination, of being able to empathize with the people who were taunting her and threatening her. When the psychologist just kept pressing her, he's like, you felt sorry for them. You kept saying, aren't you just angry at them? Aren't you sad about them? You feel sorry for them? He just couldn't believe it. And finally she said, don't you think they need feeling sorry for? The opposite of empathy and the moral imagination is xenophobia, the fear of the strange, of the foreign, of the unfamiliar. In place of the word xenophobia, Nate proposes the simpler term otherize, to make a person or group seem like an other, different from us, one of them instead of one of us. And he cites 7 ways that people often otherize instead of practicing empathy in the moral imagination. We can demonize the other, treating the other as someone to be feared and eliminated if possible. We can romanticize the other, treating the other as far superior to ourselves than they actually perhaps are, as we later discover often. Colonize the other, treating the other as inferior. Generalize, treating the other as a non-individual. Trivializing the other, ignoring what makes the other actually disturbingly different from you. Homogenizing the other, claiming that there's really no difference. And vaporizing, refusing to acknowledge the presence of the other at all. Looking back on your life, and you may can reflect on this more later as well, which of these approaches have been most or least tempting for you, and why? And might it have something to do with what was modeled for you in your childhood and other places? Which ones have you experienced most yourself of others acting that way to you, and which ones do you witness most frequently in our world today? There are many examples in Nate's book of wrestling with this tension between trying to be our best selves when we're relaxed and well-rested and most able, having the greatest capacity to empathize with others and to use our moral imagination, and that tension between when we are our worst selves, when we are under stress or tired and more likely to succumb to that temptation to otherize those around us. For now, I'll limit myself just to 2 examples, and as I share them, I invite you to think about what are parallel experiences in your life. Nate calls the first episode Meeting the 1%. He and his partner Vikram had arrived an hour and a half early to get a good seat at a highly anticipated lecture at a local university. Not long before the lecture was to begin, Vikram went to the bathroom. After he was gone, a woman approached his seat, picked up Vikram's coat, and Nate turned and said, "No, I'm sorry, that's reserved. He's in the bathroom." But she sat down anyway. He repeated himself, but she just stared straight ahead, ignoring him. She then passed Vikram's coat to her husband, who dropped it on the floor of the aisle. About that time, he spotted Vikram returning down the aisle, and Nate said, look, he's right there. And finally, she spoke to him and said, "We sponsored this event." In the midst of a stressful situation, let's just say that Nate's best self didn't emerge in the next moment. He began speaking loudly and at length in an attempt to publicly shame her, and concluded by saying, "You must be somebody really famous. Are you famous? If not, let me help you be." And he took out his smartphone and took a picture of her and said, "I'll call this one entitlement." As the light then dimmed in the theater, Nate and Vikram managed to find a seat in the back. Reflecting later, he realized that 2 days previous, he's a preacher after all, on Sunday morning he had said these words: "When we feel the impulse to be enraged, we must accept the invitation to be empathetic and to no longer make people the object of our aggression." It turns out the moral imagination is easier said than done. And by no means am I saying that we should be doormats when we encounter injustice. Rather, I think the invitation here is to become more conscious of our temptation to otherize people in times of stress and conflict, demonizing them, treating them as inferior, generalizing them in ways that ignore the reasons that may have led them to behave badly on this occasion. And here's an even more important twist. In addition to the intrinsic value of recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, there's also an extrinsic value. Nate, for example, found that as he continued to otherize this woman, that as long as he did that, he was obsessed with her in this really unhealthy way. He kept rehearsing the story to everyone he met, showing them this picture that he took triumphantly. And for him, he finally decided, I've got to delete this picture. He also realized in retrospect that his righteous anger was amplified because this episode happened during the crackdowns on the Occupy Wall Street protesters, which had left him predisposed to anger, not really just at the rich generally, but especially at those who were rich and selfish. In contrast to his angry shaming of this woman, speaking from his best self, Nate has written, I once believed it was powerful to condemn wrongdoers. I believed it was right to tear down other people's unexamined assumptions and vaporize those whose presence was not worthy of my attention. I believed that others were the cause of my aggression, and that others were to blame for my feelings of despair and disappointment and righteous indignation. I was doing justice, but I came to realize I was doing justice while being an ass. As Thich Nhat Hanh, a Zen Buddhist, once said, I came to set the prisoner free, only to realize that the prisoner was me. What might it look like in the coming days and weeks when we inevitably find ourselves stumbling into conflict with another, to take a step back and to use our moral imagination to consider, where is this person coming from? And how might my next actions, my next words emerge from my best self? That being said, we've already seen that Nate found it much easier to preach this approach on Sunday than to practice it Tuesday night in the theater. And for the second encounter, I want to complicate matters further with a story about Thich Nhat Hanh, whose wisdom was a capstone to our first example. Hanh is one of our great living wisdom teachers. He was nominated by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the Nobel Peace Prize. All that is true, and yet, a few years ago, when attending a retreat led by Hanh, Nate was taken aback when he discovered that men and women were required to sit separately in the meditation hall. As we've already seen, Nate is not a shy wallflower, so he actually, in this case, though, respectfully and compassionately asked Hanh about the reasoning behind this gender segregation, gender apartheid, if you will, which seemed like an obvious contradiction to his teachings about interdependence and non-duality. Hanh replied, ask any woman, and she will tell you she likes to be with other women. It's not segregation. And it obviously is, right? In general, Hanh is a source of tremendous wisdom and insight and experience. But on this point, in my judgment, and in Nate's as well, he appears to be unwisely defending an antiquated patriarchal practice using unconvincing and sexist reasoning that probably he hasn't actually talked to that many women about. Now, at first, Nate was really wounded and disillusioned by this encounter, but as he continued to try to practice empathy in the moral imagination, he began to see that Hanh wasn't speaking out of a vacuum. As wise as he is in many ways, he's also a product of his time and his social location, as we all are. Nate writes, I began to see Hanh as a continuation of his teachers. He is, after all, literally the 42nd patriarch of the Lam Ti school of Zen Buddhism. He says, I began to see my experiences at this retreat as an intercultural encounter between a Vietnamese and an American, an intergenerational encounter between an 83-year-old and a 33-year-old. I began to see my encounter as an interreligious experience between a Zen master and a Unitarian Universalist minister. And here's the key point. Nate says, I began to see Thich Nhat Hanh as simply human, neither romanticizing him nor demonizing him. Because we otherize people not only when we demonize, generalize, and trivialize, but also when we treat them as lesser than ourselves, but also when we romanticize them and treat them as far superior to ourselves. What person or group are you most likely to falsely romanticize? How might your moral imagination help you more see fully the messy, imperfect humanity of that person or group. For now, I'll conclude with these words from Nate's book, Cultivating Empathy, the inherent worth and dignity of every person without exception. He writes, "It's possible for me to understand an other person's views without necessarily either agreeing with them or silencing my own voice. And understanding is a prerequisite for empathy. This encounter becomes an ethical one when we use the moral imagination to see our shared humanity and to dare to forge a new way of being with one another. When we observe oppression, let us develop strategies that free not only the oppressed, but also the oppressor. Let us remember that those who use their power to deny freedom to others are also imprisoned, even if they don't know it. They are also worthy of our care. Do not let their unjust actions inspire us to cruelty, or else we will soon become that which we set out against. Rather than shoving our foot on the oppressor's neck, let us learn and risk reaching out a hand, offering a seat, to show them and even ourselves a new way of justice making by collectively experimenting with the moral imagination." Now, all of that is easier said than done, but I'm grateful to be with you on this journey to building the beloved community toward collective liberation. Collective liberation meaning when we all get free. So in that spirit of listening to one another more deeply and really noticing the fullness of one another in the coming days and weeks, I invite you to rise and embody your spirit and let's sing together hymn 10:12, When I Am Frightened.
Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go. Love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in darkness for the light that is you.